If that hive didn't grow, obviously it wasn't going to produce honey. What was the point of holding on to it? And so we'd pinch that queen and replace it. If a hive swarmed, well, then we no longer, like, it's no longer that queen that we had data on. So we would replace the queen and we'd start the data collection again. And so we didn't even realize that we were doing this in the process of trying to produce more honey. But consequently, we were kicking out the ones that swarmed. We were kicking out the ones that were defensive. We were kicking out the ones that didn't grow in the spring.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Andony Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Oh, Harry, are you staying warm over there?
Well, we got a few days to go. I see we're going to be freezing in a couple days.
Well, we really, this week on our commercial beekeeping episode, we went right to the source of the cold, to Saskatchewan, to speak with a really interesting beekeeper.
It has been such a pleasure to speak with Karen Pedersen from Cut Knife, who serves as a good example for all of us about breeding and record keeping. And I am in awe of what real scientific beekeeping is all about. Karen, in this episode, sharpens the pencil on what true scientific beekeeping is all about, and I'm in awe of it.
It's really amazing just hearing the story of how the Pedersen operation has become self-sufficient for stock and the queen improvement program. I think listeners are in for a real treat in hearing how a kind of like well-structured, organized beekeeping operation can look like.
I'm leaving this podcast wanting to be a better beekeeper. Everyone will enjoy this episode and get a major amount of encouragement on being a better beekeeper in their operations.
Okay, well, without further ado, let's go to our conversation with Karen Pedersen on our commercial beekeeping segment this week on PolliNation.
Karen, very nice to have you on PolliNation.
It's nice to be here.
Well, so right now up in Cut Knife, what are we looking at temperatures?
Today it was about minus 20 degrees Celsius, and we're warming up. On the weekend it was down to minus 30, and so when the wind was blowing, they talk about they have a wind chill factor that they measure. And so, they'll say feels like minus 40, skin will freeze in 30 seconds. So that's what we were dealing with on the weekend, but we're in the process of warming up right now.
So what would you expect as being the lowest temperatures as we enter winter, as we are now? What would be the worst and a moderate temperature there in Cut Knife?
So for me, an ideal winter would be between minus 10 and minus 35 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
A minus 35 is probably as cold as it gets. Minus 35 is brilliant because it kills things like wax moth larvae, like it kind of shuts things down and it helps us with pest control. Minus 10 is nice, like that's a nice working temperature. When it starts getting warmer than that, that's when you actually start getting ice, and it becomes more dangerous, and because things are melting and freezing and melting and freezing, and that's just a pain. So an ideal winter would be somewhere between minus 10 and minus 35.
Wow, very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've worked your way into overwintering bees up in such an environment? I mean, you just have to know, for us in Oregon, we're a bunch of crybabies when the weather gets down to -7. -7, oh my gosh.
Well, to be fair, when my family first started overwintering, so were your bees. We were bringing in California packages, and no one believed that we could actually overwinter up here. And when they started overwintering, 30% was what they expected for loss. The hives would starve, they couldn't handle that cold. And so Yeah, like it's an interesting thing because the bees have actually changed the same way that we as humans adapt to that cold weather and our blood changes and whatever, the bees have actually adapted to that as well. So yeah, like it was my father and his brothers that started overwintering bees up here. They started because like in the 70s, everyone was bringing in package bees. My family, they really wanted to do breeding because they hated, we would get these packages that there would be lots of bees, but they wouldn't produce any honey. And they were like, well, surely, like they're doing mixed farming. They were like, surely we can change this for breeding. Well, this at around the same time that they were thinking that, there was some beekeepers in Saskatchewan. Well, first of all, the price of packages doubled in a year.
Right.
And then there was another beekeeper that he got into a fight with a California package producer and ended up getting blackballed so he couldn't get bees.
Ooh.
And so all of a sudden, Saskatchewan beekeepers are talking about how precarious this business that we are in is. And they were like, okay, we can't overwinter bees here, but clearly we need to overwinter bees here. And so they just started working on it and they started sharing information and, you know, like they still would have continued on with their main interest, but on the side, they were, you know, doing little experiments on the side and sharing what they learned. And so that was, to me, that's first of all, they changed their vision. And then they were just paying attention to sort of what was going on. In 1989, my family, we had been overwintering singles and doubles. We'd been overwintering the doubles outdoors. We'd been overwintering the singles indoors. And my family, we had a fire. We had just pulled our first honey and we had a fire in the middle of the night. We lost our warehouse. We lost our shop. We lost a whole bunch of equipment. And so that winter, when we went to overwinter the bees, we didn't have storage space to put any bees inside. And so everything went outside, the doubles and the singles, everything went outside. And my family, they've always, I mean, clearly they wanted to do the breeding. So record keeping, they always had sort of basic records, the same way that you would keep them on animals. And so when the winter ended and they looked, the singles overwintered better than the doubles.
Amazing. That's amazing.
And
Really?
they went, oh. But what's interesting about this, because I suspect this is what made the difference. So I'm actually a fifth generation beekeeper. My grandfather had learned beekeeping back in Europe. And so when he moved to Canada and he got his first hives during the war, he overwintered those hives. He had 3 little hives and he overwintered them successfully. He overwintered them as singles. But then he, you know, started reading and the local information said that you couldn't keep hives in singles in Canada or in Saskatchewan. You needed to keep them in doubles for them to have enough food. So he switched his hives to doubles and he was never able to successfully overwinter a hive again.
Really?
And so I suspect that at that moment where they went, wait a minute, the singles overwintered better. And grandpa had the same experience. And so they were like, let's try this again. And so they did that for 3 years and they liked working with singles better than doubles. Okay. And so 3 years, the singles overwintered better than the doubles. They were like, we are done with doubles. That was it. And so by the time I got into beekeeping, they weren't even using doubles anymore. Like we were just using single deeps.
Do you have a strategy for insulation or various strategies for insulation or?
So by that point, Saskatchewan beekeepers had basically figured out that they needed to insulate the hives. So they would take 4 hives, they would push them together, they would wrap insulation around the outsides, and then they would put insulation on top as well. And so usually they started off with the bats and, you know, covered in black plastic. Now there's actually, you know, companies making beekeeping insulation wraps. I'm trying to remember, I think it's usually about R12 that we put around the sides, and we usually put like R20 over the top because of course heat rises. So you want to keep the tops with more. having a top entrance, so the ventilation, like the bees, as the winter progresses, the bees die and they tend to close off the bottom entrance anyways. And
Yeah.
so if you've got that top entrance, you've got a ventilation piece going on so that, you know, like, because they're constantly, as they're eating, they're generating moisture and it's condensing. And what you don't want, and this is why the insulation has to be on top, is you don't want that moisture condensing and going up to the top, to the lid, turning into water and then dripping back down on the bees.
All right. Right.
So that's why that top insulation is just absolutely key. And then another thing that we have learned over the years is actually, if you can have those hives completely covered in snow, snow is actually a really great form of insulation as well. And so if the wind blows the snow and totally covers over the hives, the best overwintered bees, they will actually, they'll generate enough radiant heat that they'll melt back a cavity inside that snow. And yeah, and it's like they have their own little igloo in there, and it protects them from the wind, it protects them from the cold.
Neat. So what kind of weight for a single? Now, when you send singles in, well, maybe we should talk about feeding in the fall, but when you send singles into the winter, I'm assuming you have a target weight for those singles. And I was just curious if so, and what kind of loss of weight that you saw throughout the winter. We've noticed here that the weight drop really kind of slows during this time of the year, but as soon as we get around February, we really start losing weight. But I think you might have a more extended winter than we do down here.
So typically we probably start feeding in about September. I want to finish feeding by probably for sure mid-October. Our winters are actually our falls have been getting warmer, so we're actually able to push that a little bit farther than we have been. The earliest that I'm probably going to go into the hives is middle to the end of March, and it's not uncommon for them to be still covered over in snow by the end of April. Wow. So that's the kind of ballpark, distance or length of time that you're looking for. So several years ago, we did actually weigh. We've got a scale on our loader, and so we actually can weigh. It's how we strip our honey, how we weigh the honey. And we did that with the hives. And it seems to me that, the low 30s of kgs, so that would be 60 to 70 pounds, I think, is what was kind of the target weight going into winter.
That's consistent with ours as well.
So that's now, and back in the 90s when I started, I don't know that they were weighing. What I remember back then is if I could lift the hive, it was too light. And if I couldn't lift the hive, it may or may not have had enough feed in it. So, you fed them as long as they would take feed. And even now we basically go for the look, they need to be full. Back then, the first thing we would do in the spring is run around and do a check for honey and just make sure that they all had honey. The very first thing that we did when we opened them in the spring was we were looking for 2 combs of crystallized honey on the outside edge of the hive. And we just blew through the hives as fast as we could, making sure that they had enough honey. I don't do that anymore. It took about 10 years and I realized that was an absolute waste of time because we had actually changed the bees. The ones that starved. We didn't breed off of them. We didn't raise them. And so you just progressively changed those genetics so that, I don't know, 10 years ago, we started putting frame feeders into our hives for the spring. And so we would actually in the spring, instead of us putting honey in, we would pull a comb of honey out to put a frame feeder in. And now I'm not even bothering to take those frame feeders out. I'm just leaving them with 9 combs over the winter and an empty frame feeder.
We had a podcast years ago when we were starting out with John Grushka, and he talked about this kind of grassroots experimentation of the Saskatchewan beekeeping industry in the 80s. and this drive towards self-sufficiency, which may sound as a a north of the border issue, but I imagine for many American beekeepers, there's also this, similar problems around supply. And can you tell us a little bit more about, you were talking about the bees changing through the breeding efforts, which also may sound weird to an American audience, that you rear your own queens way far north of us. I mean, I think in Oregon, we almost think we're too far north for queen rearing to be done at any kind of scale. Can you tell us a little bit about a little bit more about how you and other Saskatchewan beekeepers became more self-sufficient from both the, needing to resupply with packages, but also in terms of genetics, being able to, I mean, it's also kind of remarkable to us that, there are American beekeepers who get Saskatchewan genetics. That should also be a little bit like a strange, when you think about it. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. So John Gruska was actually key in this, because John Gruska came along as our provincial apiarist, and he taught us how to raise queens. So first of all, those Saskatchewan beekeepers had decided that the package industry, and depending on other people's bees, was not where they wanted to go. So first of all, they changed the location of where they wanted to go. They wanted to overwinter queens, so they started or overwinter hives, so they started figuring out how to do that. Then, of course, as you're doing this, we've got to be paying attention to what we're doing, because turns out discoveries are usually surprises. They're not following along on a script and they're just going to come along. So you've got to be paying attention to what you're learning and what's happening. So they were tracking that. They were talking about that with other beekeepers jointly. And so what did you see? What did we see? And, kind of learning together. And yeah, so we got off the well-worn paths. That's where we were kind of playing with. So my family, when we were doing this, because we started raising queens fairly early because we wanted to do that breeding. We wanted more honey. That was our goal. That was what we made our money from. And so we only, like, our seasons are so short that I would say we've got about 3 months that we can make queens, that you have a hope of them being successful. Because if you're trying to make queens in the early part of the season, you don't have enough drones yet. And so they're not going to be well-mated queens. And if you're trying to make queens at the end of the season, because it takes basically a month from, that queen being laid until that queen is laying, they start raising their winter bees end of July into August. And so if you're trying to mate the queens too late, you're not going to have enough winter bees or enough critical mass to survive those months of winter. So we figure we've got about 3 months that we can successfully mate a queen. But if what we're trying to do is to increase honey production, when we go and replace the queen, most of the bees in that hive are from the previous queen. Like the bees that are going to be raising that honey or producing that honey, the daughters were from the previous queen. So we put the new queen in there. That data doesn't mean anything in relation to that new queen. So then we would have to overwinter her, and then we would track the data the next year. That's when we would have this scale that we were tracking how much honey these, each queen was producing or their daughters were producing. Well, by the time you have the data from that 3 months, it's too late to raise queens. So that queen would have to go through 2 winters before we would breed off of her. And so that in itself was a way of kicking out the ones that didn't overwinter. We didn't know that at the time, but they had to survive 2 winters to be bred from. Then we had the data on the honey production, and so then we would breed from that. But at the same time, I don't like defensive bees. So if we had a hive that was defensive, and the way that we judged defensiveness was if you were working a hive and one hive was more defensive than the rest of the yard, every hive had a note card attached to it. We would write that down. If a hive got marked that twice, we would pinch the queen and replace her. because we just didn't like working with her. Likewise, in the spring, if the hive wasn't growing, we would mark that down on that note card. If that hive didn't grow, obviously it wasn't going to produce honey. What was the point of holding on to it? And so we'd pinch that queen and replace it. If a hive swarmed, well, then we no longer, like, it's no longer that queen that we had data on. So we would replace the queen and we'd start the data collection again. And so we didn't even realize that we were doing this in the process of trying to produce more honey. But consequently, we were kicking out the ones that swarmed. We were kicking out the ones that were defensive. We were kicking out the ones that didn't grow in the spring. Again, I didn't know this at the time, but we had fairly consistent springs. And so the flowers would bloom, the willows would come along, and by the time the willows were ending, the fruit trees were starting. And by the time the fruit trees were ending, the caraganas were starting. So we didn't do spring feeding. We actually expected them to grow based on this stimulation in the environment. And it's as the weather's been changing recently that I've started doing spring stimulus feeding, because now some of those flowers are all blooming at exactly the same time. But so consequently, I didn't even realize this until a few years ago, that I've bred not only a frugal bee for the winter time, where they're not going to eat a lot of honey over the winter. I've also bred a frugal bee in the spring that it doesn't take very much stimulus and they've turned on, that they calculate that as flowers and it's time to take off. And like in Saskatchewan, we talk about the bees exploding, and that's what we aim for.
So how many years in total has Pedersen Apiaries been selecting in this way?
So we started selecting somewhere in the late 80s. Obviously, we changed things throughout the years. And so somewhere in the mid 90s is probably when we, settled on how we were doing it. But we have actually been selecting somewhere, or at least the winters have been selecting for us since back into the 80s.
Looking at the backdrop behind you there, I think you're blowing one of my theories right out the window. They look like yellow bees. I see more yellow than I see dark there. And I have been preaching the sermon that the dark bees here, way up here in Oregon, the dark bees do better than the light bees. What have you noticed in that regard?
So of all the things that I breed for, color is not one of them. I do not care what color the bee is. I don't pay any attention to that whatsoever. And so I prefer the yellow ones in terms of finding them on a comb, but I strictly am going off of data and traits. So how much honey do they produce, whether they overwinter, whether they grow, I don't care what color they are. So I have yellow, I have black, I have tiger striped. I literally have everything.
Nice. Very nice.
Now, I guess one big difference from Oregon, and I noticed this when I, left the prairies, the Canadian prairies, to come to Oregon, is one, the industry is primarily focused on honey production, and that the honey flows can be pretty punctuated. Can you tell us a little bit about a little bit of that cycle of kind of getting a colony up to full strength to hit the honey flow, and what those honey flows are like, and how do you run an operation that is really honey focused?
Okay, so again, I don't tend to do this the same as other people. I don't like the concept of splits. And so a lot of beekeepers up here, they do splits in May or June. I don't like that. To me, the hive is spending too much time growing population rather than producing honey. So my first honey producing plant shows up around the end of May, beginning of June, and that's the caraganas. That's usually where we start getting a box or two of honey. And so I actually want my hive of strength at that point so that I'm already collecting boxes of honey at that point. I don't have to worry about those ones crystallizing, so I don't need to pull them off until July, but I want the hive's full strength. And so my method of splitting, I call it the income tax method of splitting, because I want strong hives. I want them to stay strong. And so I skim. I skim off of the strong ones. And if they're too weak, I don't skim off of them. And when I make up a split, I make it strong so that, you know, in a couple weeks or in a month, I can skim off of it too. And that also tells me if those ones aren't growing, those are the ones I want to get rid of. Those queens aren't good and I don't want to try bringing them through the winter. And the ones that I'm skimming off of, those are the ones that I want to keep. And likewise, you know, those splits, as I'm making up those new units, I want them strong enough that they're producing honey. I want them, you know, like they need to produce honey this year. And so I'm just constantly going along and pulling combs of usually capped brood out of hives and putting them, you know, making up new things, whether it's making up my mini mating nukes for mating my queens, whether it's making up 5 frames as a way of overwintering or as making starters, or as a way of making up my dead outs. I'm just constantly sort of skimming from the strong ones. And, you know, if a hive doesn't get there that I can skim off of it, it's time to replace that queen. And so I basically want to keep my hives to just under swarming level for basically the season so that they're going to produce a box or 2 off of Caraganas. They're going to produce, you know, a little bit more. June is what we call our dearth. What was funny is when I was in New Zealand, their honey flow was the equivalent of our dearth. So June is kind of they get a little bit, but it's not, we don't really consider that much of a honey producing month. And then in July, the canola comes along. That's the backbone of our honey production. And so they can fill a couple of boxes in a couple of days. Like people just can't even imagine the amount of honey we're talking about. On my scale weights, when I'm tracking honey production, it is not uncommon for me to have hives that are producing 600 pounds. That's the kind of honey that you can get off of it in a year. Saskatchewan has a hive average of 180 pounds per hive.
Amazing. That's great.
And so up here, people will get their first hive and, you know, they'll read on the internet, you're not supposed to get honey the first year. That is the quickest way to kill a hive up here, is to think you're not going to get honey. I think you should be getting 200 pounds off of, you know, potentially off of a package if you're running it properly. My brother has a hive the size of a birdhouse that he gets 50 pounds from. So, so you have to imagine, like, this is a really intense honey flow. When the canola is done, usually there's sweet clover and alfalfa. And so we, you know, make sure that we've got access to that too. So we usually can get a box or 2 off of that as well. But, you know, we're talking 3 months of a really intense, heavy honey flow. And the other thing, canola honey crystallizes, and it crystallizes very hard and it crystallizes very fast. And so this 3 months, you're not only raising queens and, you know, doing your queen, like you've got this limited time to be doing that. You also have this limited time to get this honey off before it crystallizes in the comb. And like, it is a very focused, intense, hard season.
Well, you know, you and Harry are kindred spirits because Harry is also notoriously an advocate of not splitting early and waiting. But also, Harry is, many of our beekeepers pollinate radish and have the same problem sometimes with some of the mustard crops where they've got crystallization taking place.
But of course, the difference is that this is an annual event for Karen. And us here in Oregon, we'll take our bees into turnips. By the way, Karen, the turnip is just like you described it to canola. Blows the lid right off the hives and you can't get and then they crystallize overnight. And it's something we're really not acquainted with as well. So it's surprised a lot of us.
Yeah, we always joke that there's no evidence that the honey has crystallized in the bee's stomach, but that's just because someone hasn't found it yet. So
Wow.
yeah, it is a very, like, and once that crystallization starts, like you can't stop it. And so
Oh,
we're
no.
fighting it in the combs, we're fighting it in the extractors, we're fighting it in the sumps, we're fighting it in the tanks.
Yep.
I saw a picture last year, I think it was, of a truck that had tipped over and the honey barrels had fallen out, and the honey was running on the road. Not our problem. Those barrels are solid within days. So it's and
On the
and
top,
it's a very white honey as well.
Oh,
well, that honey is a great maybe a segue to this next question. I think for the dependency of prairie beekeepers on the co-op, that there's a honey cooperative that's longstanding in Alberta and Manitoba. Can you talk a little? You've been members of the co-op. Can you tell us a little bit about how you sell your honey through the co-op, and what's the structure of those co-ops?
Yeah. So there's the Manitoba Honey Co-op and the Alberta Honey Co-op, and people are always like, well, where's the Saskatchewan one? And Saskatchewan actually amalgamated with Manitoba again long before my time. So Manitoba and Alberta Honey Co-op work together. The brand name is called Bee Made. But basically the way that it works is I ship all of my honey to them. They give me an initial price, which is usually about 50% of what they kind of expect that honey will be bought at, or the price that I will get. And then as the year progresses, about every 3 months, they give us interim payments until, you're already past the next year's crop by the time they're giving you the final payment for the last year's crop. And so what it is the co-ops, basically as beekeepers, we've hired marketing experts that are out there selling our honey. And whether that's, packing it and selling it domestically under the Bee Made label, whether that's selling it to Costco or some of the others to pack under their own labels, whether it's exporting it, they're taking care of that marketing for us. They are the biggest, basically, honey packer I actually think in Canada now. I'm not completely certain about that, but Western Canada for sure, they're the biggest ones. And so that is what they do. It's still beekeepers that are managing it. So it's beekeepers that are in control as a board, but we've basically hired marketing experts to market our honey. And I've seen other times where, there's been conversations up here about, well, when they can't source enough honey, should they be sourcing it from somewhere else? And basically the agreement has always been no, like we're sourcing Canadian honey. So they will buy honey from beekeepers that aren't necessarily members, but they don't source honey from overseas. They are literally sourcing our honey and marketing it. And so typically what happens is when the price is going down, because they're selling a lot of that honey retail for us, we usually don't hit the bottom of the market. When the price is going up, we typically don't hit the top of the market either, because they can't increase the prices that fast on the retail shelves. But in the end, they buy the barrels, like they own the barrels, so I don't have to pay for that. They actually insure that honey. As soon as I fill that barrel, they're covering the insurance, so I don't need to be doing that. I didn't even realize this was something recently. They negotiate with trucking companies. And so if you're trucking to Bee Made, it's way easier for me as a small beekeeper to arrange for a truck to ship to Bee Made, as opposed to if I'm trying to do that individually on my own. And so there's a lot of these kind of advantages that, in the end, we probably average out price the same as what the private guys do. But because we're smaller, it gives us, or a lot of us are smaller beekeepers that are members of the co-op, it gives us power in the marketplace. And I wouldn't be a beekeeper without it. Because the other piece is we sell way too much honey to market it locally, right? Like there's just no way that 600 pounds a hive, there is no way that I can get rid of that in cut knife. Like it's just impossible. So, we are looking at, we've got to export honey because there is not enough people up here to eat the amount of honey that Western Canada can produce.
I like that. It allows you to focus on your beekeeping.
Yeah.
Of course, talking about the honey coming off, the very next thought that pops into our minds is Varroa control. And once that honey's off, you have such a short season with your bees. I'm guessing your Varroa problems, I'm hoping your problems are less than what we see down here where we have a much longer brooding period. How's that all worked out?
So I didn't get Varroa until 2008. So I've had it for about 16 years. So you need to, give me a little bit of leeway here in that I haven't actually been dealing with it for that long in comparison. Canada closed the border in 1987 to prevent the movement of Varroa, and that gave me another 20 years of Varroa-free beekeeping. Nice. It gave me the ability to do that breeding, that winter breeding, the honey breeding, without having to worry about Varroa. So, and you're right. I mean, the season and how short the season is makes a huge difference to the Varroa, in that I struggle with singles in the spring. By the time I need to put a honey super on, there actually isn't a long enough window. Like, there was barely a long enough window to put Apistan on, and to put Apivar, like the Amatraz product, on. I didn't use it in the spring because there just wasn't a long enough window there. And so I started experimenting with, formic and oxalic, and we put everything on screen bottom boards right away. So again, this is something people are like, well, up there, you can't have them on screen bottom boards. I have them on screen bottom boards year round. I never take them off screen bottom boards. I don't know that that does anything, but it helps me regulate moisture in the hives. We control the drone brood in our hives. So we try and limit how much drone comb there is in the hives, so how much the queen has to lay on it. Because right from the beginning, we looked at those curves and we're like, well, that should limit how much Varroa we're getting if we can just limit how much drones there are. And given the breeding that we're doing, I control my drone breeding, or my drone population, as much as I control my queen mothers. I don't want them just mating to random drones out there. And so consequently, I don't actually want hives that I don't want to breed off of producing drones. So that actually works in conjunction with, me controlling how much drone brood is in the hives for Varroa. So those were just some things we did right off the beginning. We started doing shaking samples from breeders, so that we were now choosing, anything that had kind of made it through those 2 winters and had produced enough honey. We started shaking samples from those. And basically, if they had low mites, we would breed off of them. And if they didn't have low mites, it didn't matter if they'd produced a lot of honey, we wouldn't breed off of them. We did that for probably 10 years. It was a lot of work, and we weren't actually sure it was doing anything because we were still having to use formic. We were still having to use oxalic. Periodically we still had to use something like an Apistan or an Apivar. And so, but I was talking like every 2 or 3 years we had to do that. So 5 years ago, we stopped doing all that shaking, and we were like, well, let's just go back to, we're not looking at that. It was doing something. The amount of treating for Varroa that we need to do now in comparison to 5 years ago is phenomenal. Like, I would say we lost a huge, what we had gained, we lost it in 5 years. I don't think it'll take us that long to pull it back, but having to treat every spring, or now, guys, we're treating in the spring, we're treating, formic potentially in the summer, we're maybe needing to treat something in the fall, but this window is so small that it's really hard for us to do that. And so some of the guys are using the thyme oil products, but I haven't used those just because the window with the temperatures, you know, like the honey supers have to be off, it has to be warm enough. And there just isn't a very long time period in there. And so we've been using oxalic drizzle, we've been using formic acid, which has been interesting because we've used formic since the beginning. And I was asking Nod apiaries last year, when we first started using formic, we killed queens, and particularly 2-year-old queens or queens that were weak, you know, that were kind of risky. We killed them. Well, lately I can push temperatures on that. I use formic in, like, you know, in a hot spell and not necessarily, you know, giving them enough ventilation, and I don't kill queens. And so I asked Nod, is it possible that we're actually breeding a resistant bee the same way that we bred a bee that could handle the winters? Is it possible that we're actually breeding a bee that can handle formic? Because I'm not seeing those kind of queen losses that, you know, I did at the beginning. So that's kind of what we're doing. The same thing is with my other breeding that I've been like, okay, you got to kick out the worst. That's what was successful as breeding. We're actually, what we're wanting to do now, we use bee escapes to take our honey off in the summertime. And so we're actually thinking, we've got the screen bottom boards on there. We're kind of thinking if we stick a sticky board in when we put the bee escape on, and we pull it out when we pull this bee escape off, and we're just going to look at those boards quickly and say yes or no, and just try starting to pull out the ones that are not got high varroa populations that way. Because there has got to be a quick way of breeding for varroa tolerance or resistance that isn't some convoluted, expensive test that no commercial beekeeper has time to do.
And just so that a listener can absorb that, so the reason for doing it at the time that you're pulling your honey is that then it gives you an opportunity, the honey's off, and you can start your treatments again. So in one fell swoop, you kind of get a sense if there's, well, I guess this is for your breeding as well. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Maybe I don't understand why the bee escape, why the bee. Now I don't understand. Tell me exactly why that's a good time to test.
So when we were doing our testing in the past, when we were doing our alcohol shakes, we were trying to do that after we finished taking the honey off, but before we put treatment on in the fall. The problem is we've got such a short, intense season that when you get the honey off, you need to get the feed on. Like right now, you don't have time to be going out and spending time shaking varroa samples. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do I identify which ones have high varroa counts and which ones have low varroa counts without me having to somehow fit more work into my intense season. And so when we're pulling honey every 2 weeks during the honey season, if I can be sticking a sticky board in and out, is it possible for me to figure out which ones are higher in varroa counts or lower in varroa counts during that period without adding a lot of extra work or driving?
And did I understand you correctly that you use a boom loader?
Yes. Yeah,
Because
we use the easy loader.
Oh yeah, so I have an easy loader as well. And for pulling skateboards, there's no other way. That is just.
Oh, I bet you, because you could just slip it in and down it goes. Oh,
that's
yeah.
right.
Like we go in there with the boom loader and we pull up 5 supers, like 5 full supers, and you put down 2 empties and you put the bee escape on and you put the full ones back down. And then you come in and, you know, a day or 2 later and you pull those full ones off, you put more empty supers on, and you take these boxes into the extracting room. Our boxes don't even get broke apart. Like that burr comb in between the hives doesn't even get broke apart until it's into the extracting room.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, my mentor had a great big Kelly loader, and I went out with them, and you'd go to the first yard and do exactly that. You would place the escape board, and then you'd drive to the next yard that had that on for a couple of days. And as Karen says, you lift them off 5 supers at a time, 4 supers at a time with the boom. what a blessing a boom loader is for that type of operation.
Oh, it was brilliant. And we got into that when the guys were getting older and they couldn't do that lifting anymore, that
Yeah.
tossing around of the boxes. And I'm only 5'2", so I never could lift those boxes up onto the trailer. And so I, with that boom loader, can go out. My dad's in his 80s. He and I can go and pull a yard, with
Nice.
that boom loader. So
That's
it's,
great.
yeah.
It's the last piece of beekeeping equipment I would ever let go of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and for us, that intense season, I always struggle finding enough short-term labor to help me pull that honey. And that boom loader makes all the difference in the world.
Oh yeah, I bought my boom loader when my son got his driver's license. So
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe just to wrap things up here, what are the pressing tasks for, beekeeping in Cut Knife in January?
So unfortunately, I'm still working on my year end. I shouldn't be, but that's what I'm still working on. But we're doing some repairing. I sort through all of my brood combs. So all of my combs that I put in as foundation into the honey boxes this year, I'm going to go through every single one of those this winter, and I'm going to mark the ones that have too much drone brood on it or too much drone cell so that they never go into my brood chamber. They will constantly remain a honey comb. And so that's a job that's coming up. It's bearing down on me pretty soon. And then, this weekend, because of the cold weather, I was also fighting with my water system freezing up. So there's lots of fun jobs like that too.
So, and with this, just can you walk us through so you're calling out the the drone comb when dead outs are coming in? I didn't quite catch that. You said when your foundation, I didn't.
Okay, so when we build foundation, we automatically put a year stamp on it. So this coming spring, I'm going to build foundation and I'm going to put a 25 on the top bar. And I'm going to stick it into my honey supers next spring and draw it out. And then my extracting crew is going to next summer at the end of the season, all of those combs that have the numbers on them that I say aren't branded. So all of those combs that were basically foundation or new, they're going to sort them out separately so that I've got this whole separate grouping to look at. I'm going to look at those combs. If they've got what I consider more than 1% drone cell on them, I'm actually going to take a branding iron and I'm going to brand that 25 or that 24 or that 23, whatever that number is, which basically says this isn't good enough for brood. And so all of those branded combs with that number that's branded, it goes into the honey supers, never to leave the honey supers. All of the ones that were drawn that didn't have a lot of drone cell on them, they keep that number that isn't branded. That then becomes my pool of new brood comb going into the boxes. And it does two things. It tells me there isn't drone comb on there, and it tells me how old that comb is, so that when I then am pulling old combs out of my boxes, I know what their age is.
Amazing.
Well, I've got to tell you, Karen, that a million years ago, my 10th grade job was working on a dairy. And I became very familiar with two different dairy operations. One of them was very scientific farmers and kept meticulous records. And the other one was as sloppy gets. And I just love and appreciate everything I've heard about. Your methodology is good farming. It's good business. And I really respect and appreciate what you do and the way you do it.
But the key to that is record keeping is necessary, but it has to be useful record keeping. You've got to figure out the way of doing record keeping that actually doesn't require a lot of time or effort to, it's the same thing as those Varroa tests. I don't want an expensive, convoluted way of doing this. I want something that's quick and easy and kind of a yes or no, this is good or not. And to me, that's, you can't get anywhere to me if you don't have that data to base your decisions on. but that data has to be easy to collect and easy to analyze.
So no nitrogen tests on your frames is what I'm hearing.
No, we tried that basically 30 years ago and we got rid of that. And so we didn't figure it was
Great.
that useful.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for taking time. It's been really enlightening, and it's been wonderful catching up with you.
You too. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.